Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story, Until the Last Horizon. The USS Mercy bucked like a dying beast, groaning beneath the impact of what felt like 1,000 hammers. Nurse Evelyn Carter, her white uniform already stained with oil and fear, gripped the rail of the sickbay. The air, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of smoke, clawed at her throat. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice thin against the cacophony of groaning steel and distant explosions. Her hands, usually so steady and precise, trembled. She tried to secure a bandage on a young corporal's arm, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. Outside, the roar of anti-aircraft guns was a continuous, futile prayer against the relentless onslaught. This wasn't the orderly chaos of a hospital ward, but the raw, unbridled savagery of war itself, swallowing the very sea beneath them. A shudder, more violent than any before, ripped through the ship. A deafening blast tore through the deck just aft of them, showering them with hot debris. The corporal cried out, his grip slipping from her frantic hold. Evelyn felt herself lifted, then flung into the churning blackness that was once the Pacific's serene expanse. The icy shock of the water, thick with oil and the debris of destruction, stole her breath. She fought instinctively against the crushing current, the distant screams of men fading as the ocean's cold embrace pulled her under. Darkness, then a terrifying, brilliant white flash, and then nothing. A gasp tore through her, raw and involuntary, as she fought her way back to the surface, spluttering. The world was gone, the noise, the smoke, the screams, all of it replaced by a blue so deep it hurt the eyes, and him, a stranger's face etched with a grimness that felt older than the war itself. He knelt over her, his own face smeared with grime, a fresh, angry gash weeping crimson along his forearm. He was dragging her, inch by agonizing inch, from the gentle lapping of the waves onto the blinding white sand of a beach. She coughed, salt water burning her throat. Her mind, a jumble of fragmented images, the sinking ship, the faces of her patients, the impossible blue of the sky, struggled to find purchase. This was not the chaotic, fiery inferno she remembered. This was an unnerving silence, broken only by the gentle shush of the waves and the distant cry of seabirds. The air, once heavy with smoke and death, was now clean, fragrant with unknown blossoms and the salt tang of a pristine ocean. There was a silence so profound it was almost louder than the explosions that had brought them here. "You're awake!" A gruff voice cut through her daze. Mateo Ramirez. His eyes, dark and unwavering, assessed her with a pragmatic intensity that offered no comfort, only fact. "Don't try to move yet. You swallowed a good deal of water." He didn't offer a hand, didn't soften his tone. He was a man of action, not solace, and his immediate focus was on survival. His uniform, like hers, was torn and stained, clinging to his muscular frame. A torn pocket revealed a faint glimpse of dog tags. Evelyn managed a weak nod, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The pain in her head throbbed with the rhythm of her bewildered heart. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the pristine curve of the beach, framed by swaying palms. It was too beautiful to be real, a painted backdrop for a nightmare. And then, at the edge of the water, half submerged in the gentle surf, lay the wreckage of a single lifeboat, a constant broken reminder of their old world. It was a grim monument to their isolation. "My arm," Mateo said, his voice curt, jolting her from her daze. "It needs tending." Her nurse's training, a finely honed instinct, asserted itself over the lingering shock. Her hands, though still trembling, found purpose. She tore a strip from the hem of her soaked uniform skirt. It was not sterile, not ideal, but it was all they had. She cleaned the wound as best she could with what little fresh water Mateo had managed to collect in a cupped palm, her touch surprisingly delicate despite the urgency. His gaze, steady and intense, never left her face, watching her every movement with an unnerving scrutiny. He didn't wince, didn't complain, simply endured. "It's deep," she murmured, her voice still hoarse. "It needs stitches, but—" She trailed off, the stark reality of their situation pressing down. No medical supplies, no operating theatre, no fellow nurses. Only the vast, indifferent ocean and the terrifying beauty of this unknown land. "It'll do," he replied, a stoic acceptance in his tone. Better than nothing. He watched her tie the makeshift bandage, a grim appreciation in his eyes. He saw the competence, not the terror that still lurked beneath her professional facade. It was a strange sort of validation, stark and unadorned. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft violet, the pragmatic corporal began to move. While Evelyn rested, still weak and disoriented, Mateo scoured the immediate vicinity. He found a small freshwater spring bubbling up from porous rock, and soon the rhythmic thwack of his machete, rescued somehow from the chaos, against palm fronds filled the air. He was a man utterly in his element, carving order from the chaos, while she was a woman whose well-ordered life had been shattered into a million glittering pieces. Her upbringing in a proper Boston home, with its strictures and its quiet expectations, felt a million miles away, a fragile dream against the raw, unyielding reality of their present. The shelter he fashioned was crude, a lean-to of woven palm fronds offering scant protection, but it was shelter nonetheless. He worked with an almost brutal efficiency, his movements economical, driven by an innate understanding of survival. He didn't speak much, his focus unwavering, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, the trees, the ground, ever vigilant. As dusk deepened, bringing with it a sudden drop in temperature, Evelyn huddled beneath the meagre cover of the fronds, watching him. He started a small fire, coaxing flames from dry tinders with a practiced ease that awed her. The flickering light cast his features into sharp relief, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw, the tired but resolute set of his mouth. He was a stranger, yet he was their only hope, their only tether to life. She thought of her world, the one that was gone, the quiet hum of the hospital, the crisp scent of antiseptic, the gentle murmur of Boston Common in autumn. Here the air hummed with the unknown, with the raw, untamed essence of nature. She was Nurse Evelyn Carter, and she was adrift, marooned not just on an island, but from every facet of her former existence. And beside her, Corporal Mateo Ramirez, a man who seemed to embody the wild, untamed spirit of this new reality. They were a study in contrasts, her genteel upbringing versus his raw pragmatism, her quiet despair against his grim determination. The acrid smell of smoke and salt water still clung to her, a phantom of the wreck. But now it mingled with the clean green scent of the jungle and the wood smoke from their fire. The jarring silence of the island, broken only by the cry of seabirds, was slowly, imperceptibly, settling around them, claiming them. Weeks bled into months on the atoll, marked less by the calendar that no longer existed, and more by the steady rhythm of the tide and the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons. The island, once a symbol of their terrifying isolation, began to reveal itself as something else entirely, a verdant, vibrant prison that slowly, miraculously transformed into a sanctuary. The initial stark awe of survival settled into a quiet, almost contemplative routine, akin to the slow unfolding of unspoken understanding that Elizabeth Gaskell so masterfully depicted. Mateo, with his innate connection to the wild, became their guide. He taught Evelyn how to weave palm fronds not just for a crude lean-to, but for a sturdier, more comfortable shelter that could withstand the tropical downpours. His large, calloused hands, once terrifying in their gruff efficiency, now moved with a patient dexterity as he showed her how to fashion a sharpened stick into a rudimentary fishing spear. He taught her to read the subtle signs of the sea, to know where the fish ran, when the tide would turn. Evelyn, in turn, with her precise observational skills honed by years of nursing, discovered edible roots and berries, identifying them from the myriad of unknown flora. She cultivated a small meticulous garden near their freshwater spring, coaxing life from the rich island soil, a small patch of order in the grand wildness. Their professional distance, born of the ship's hierarchy and the shock of their shared ordeal, softened into a necessary partnership, each relying on the other's unique strengths. The silent language of shared survival gradually eclipsed the formal address. It was no longer Nurse Carter and Corporal Ramirez, but simply Evelyn and Mateo. One afternoon, a torrential tropical storm descended upon the island, a furious symphony of wind and rain that lashed at their little shelter. They were forced into the close confines of their woven sanctuary, the world outside a roaring, impenetrable wall of water. The dim light, the drumming rain on the fronds, and the sheer force of the elements trapped them, forcing an intimacy born of necessity. To pass the endless hours and distract from the primal fear that stirred within them both, they began to speak, truly speak for the first time. Evelyn spoke of her life in Boston, a world of brownstone houses, hushed libraries and the polite society gatherings where every word was measured, every emotion carefully veiled. She spoke of her aspirations to serve, to heal, the quiet satisfaction of her nursing career. "I always thought my life was planned," she confessed, her voice soft against the drumming rain. "Like a railway line, college, nursing, marriage to someone suitable. It never occurred to me that one could simply be here. There are no expectations, only existence." Mateo listened, his dark eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by their small lamp. Then slowly, hesitantly at first, he began to speak of his own world, the vibrant, challenging upbringing in a Los Angeles barrio, the sprawling, boisterous family, the street-level pragmatism that had shaped him. He spoke of the struggle, the hustle, the constant need to prove himself in a society that often saw only his name, not his character. He described the laughter, the fierce loyalty, the rich tapestry of his community. As he spoke, the gruff corporal, the survivalist, faded, and the complex, passionate man beneath the uniform emerged. This was the first time they truly saw the person behind the uniform, the stories etched into their souls. The storm raged, but within their shelter a different kind of calm settled, a deep, resonant understanding. The space between them, once filled with unspoken formality, was now permeable, inviting. A week later, a moment of profound, almost shocking connection occurred. Evelyn, wading in the shallows searching for shellfish, cried out sharply. A translucent ribbon of pain, white-hot and immediate, shot up her leg. A jellyfish. Mateo, who had been fishing nearby, was at her side in an instant. His face, usually so impassive, contorted with concern. He scooped her into his arms with surprising ease, carrying her back to their camp. He laid her gently on their palm-frond bed. The light was fading, casting the small shelter in a soft, ethereal glow. His hands, which had built their world, were now incredibly gentle as he examined the angry red welt on her calf. He crushed some local leaves he knew for their soothing properties, mixing them with a little fresh water, and then, with infinite care, applied the poultice to her skin. His touch was feather-light, stripped of all pretense, devoid of conscious thought, merely concern. Evelyn watched him, her breath catching in her throat. The pain from the sting was sharp, but a deeper, more profound sensation was blossoming within her. She saw the crinkle at the corners of his eyes, the slight furrow of his brow, the concentration in his gaze. He wasn't Mateo the Corporal, Mateo the survivalist. He was simply Mateo, a man tending to her, his vulnerability laid bare in the quiet intensity of his care. The air crackled with a new palpable awareness, a delicate thread of desire woven into the fabric of their shared existence. When his fingers brushed her skin, a shiver, entirely unrelated to the pain, traced its way up her spine. The silence that followed was charged, electric, filled with unspoken words and the burgeoning understanding that this island had given them more than just survival. It had given them each other. Mateo watched her sleep later that night, the dim light of the fire playing across her features. In her world, a man like him would be invisible. Or worse, a curiosity, a temporary deviation from the norm. Here, she saw him. Just him, the man, not the label. The steady rhythm of the tide marking their days seemed to echo the beat of his own heart. A heart that was beginning to belong to this place, and to the woman beside him. The shared taste of roasted fish and coconut, once a simple necessity, was now flavoured with the quiet intimacy of their days. And on the small shelf she had fashioned from driftwood, her growing collection of smoothed sea glass and shells glittered in the firelight, creating beauty amidst the wildness, a symbol of Evelyn's quiet transformation. The second year on the island unfolded with a gentle, almost dreamlike cadence. Their life had settled into a comfortable domestic rhythm, a harmony born of shared labour and unspoken understanding. The days were a warm tapestry woven with the silver of dawn, the golden haze of midday, and the velvet indigo of the starlit nights. Yet beneath this idyllic surface a current of melancholy began to stir, a quiet fear of the outside world, akin to the atmospheric tension that often precedes a storm. One morning the tides, ever the bringers of both sustenance and sorrow, delivered something alien to their pristine shores. Debris, not the familiar flotsam of fallen coconuts or washed-up coral, but something starkly, terrifyingly human. A tattered American flag, faded and torn, but unmistakably its colours, was snagged on a piece of a splintered raft. Beside it, incongruously, lay a waterlogged journal, its leather cover warped and swollen, its pages a pulpy mass, yet still bearing the ghost of printed words. Mateo, ever vigilant, was the first to find them. His call to Evelyn was not the usual cheerful summons to a fresh catch, but a low, guttural sound that spoke of dread. They stood together side by side on the sand, gazing at the grim offerings of the sea. The flag, a symbol of the world they'd left behind, now felt like a shroud, heavy with the weight of unspeakable losses. Evelyn, with her innate reverence for human stories, carefully, almost reverently opened the journal. The ink had bled, the paper was fragile, but some entries were still legible, a ghostly testament to a young sailor's final days. His words spoke of battles won and lost, of comrades fallen, of a world that had moved on without them, a world still steeped in the brutal theatre of war. The reality of time passing, of their families believing them dead, settled heavily between them, a cold, oppressive weight that extinguished the island's warmth. "They've mourned me," Evelyn whispered, her voice a fragile reed, tears streaming unchecked down her face. "They've had a funeral, my mother. Oh, Mateo. My mother put on a black dress and said goodbye to a ghost." The words were a lament, a cry for a life irrevocably lost, for the pain her disappearance had surely caused. The peace of the island, once a balm, now felt like a cruel deception. Mateo stood silent, his back to her, staring out at the ocean that had brought them here, and now brought these grim reminders. He picked up a piece of driftwood, absently turning it over and over in his hands. His silence was not lack of feeling, but a profound, almost terrifying withdrawal. He was grappling with his own demons, with the stark, unavoidable truth of a future he had dared to forget. "They find us, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice rough, devoid of its usual warmth. It was less a question and more a statement of bleak certainty. "What then? You go back to your world and I go back to mine. There's a bigger ocean between Boston and my home than this one." He didn't turn to face her, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon, on the chasm of class and racial prejudice that separated their origins, a chasm that had seemed to vanish on this isolated patch of land. His words were not a rejection of her, but a raw articulation of a fear that had haunted him his entire life. The fear of being an outsider, of never truly belonging. The discovery created the first real emotional distance between them. Evelyn wept for the family she had lost, for the innocent life she had once led, now irrevocably altered. She mourned the future that had been stolen. Mateo, meanwhile, grew quiet and withdrawn, his usual pragmatism replaced by a brooding despondency. He was haunted by the thought of returning to a country where he'd still have to fight for basic respect, where the colour of his skin, the sound of his name, would define him more than his courage or his capabilities. The idea of a relationship with a woman like Evelyn, a woman of her social standing in that world, seemed not just impossible, but a cruel joke. The island, which had been their sanctuary, now felt like a fragile bubble, easily burst by the sharp edges of reality. The tattered, sun-bleached flag flapped mournfully in the gentle breeze, a silent sentinel to their lost innocence. The ghostly faded ink of the sailor's journal lay open, its pages whispering tales of a brutal world they had forgotten but could not escape. And the most painful anchor of all was the sudden, oppressive silence that fell between them, a silence where comfortable quiet once lived, now filled with the unspoken weight of their diverging futures. They walked the beach separately, ate their meals in quietude, the effortless camaraderie that had blossomed between them replaced by a chasm of unspoken anxieties. The horizon, once a promise of endless possibility, now seemed to press in, confining them. Nearly 3 years had passed since the USS Mercy surrendered to the sea, since Evelyn and Mateo had been cast onto this Eden. The island was no longer merely a place of survival. It was their home, intricately woven into the fabric of their beings. Their days had become a quiet epic, each sunrise a testament to their resilience, each sunset a whispered promise of another, shared tomorrow. But the quiet tension born of the shipwreck journal had festered, an unaddressed wound between them, a constant reminder of the world they had fled. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, Mateo saw it first. A glint in the impossibly blue sky, a silver fish flashing against the boundless azure. It was a minuscule speck at first, easily dismissed as a trick of the light, but his eyes, honed by years of scanning horizons and searching for signs, knew better. A hum, faint but growing, reached his ears, a sound alien and terrifyingly familiar. An American reconnaissance plane, instinct sharpened by the military training and a deep-seated sense of duty took over. "Evelyn, he roared, his voice urgent, cutting through the island's serene hum. He began frantically gathering dry palm fronds, branches, anything that would burn. His face, usually so readable to her now, was a mask of profound conflict. Grim determination battling with a sorrow that threatened to consume him. The signal fire, a beacon to salvation, was also a funeral pyre for their private world. They worked together, their movements swift and wordless, a synchronized dance born of years of unspoken partnership. Smoke billowed into the sky, a dark plume against the brilliant blue, a desperate message to the world that had forgotten them. They knew rescue is now inevitable. The coming dawn will bring ships, men, and the shattering end of their secluded existence. The knowledge hung between them, heavy and suffocating, both a prayer answered and a sentence pronounced. Their hearts, once beating in unison with the island's quiet rhythm, now hammered with a frantic, desperate urgency. That night, the signal fire burned like a funeral pyre for their life on the island, casting long, dancing shadows that mimicked their restless hearts. They didn't speak of the rescue, didn't utter the words that would make it real, make it undeniable. Instead, under the brilliant, indifferent canopy of stars, their silent witnesses, the only constant from their old life to their new one, they came together in a moment of profound, sorrowful, and deeply loving surrender. It was not a physical demand, but an aching acknowledgement of their impending loss, a desperate attempt to memorize each other before they are torn apart. Mateo reached out, his rough palm cupping her cheek with impossible softness, his thumb tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. His eyes, usually so guarded, were raw with emotion, reflecting the flickering firelight and a desperate, boundless longing. He kissed her not with the simple affection that had grown between them over the past years, but with the force of a man trying to breathe in a memory, to absorb every facet of her being into his very soul. His lips, at first tentative, grew urgent, deepening the ache in her chest, a silent plea for time to stop. Her gasp turned into a soft moan as his hands traced her back, her waist, the gentle curve of her hip, as if mapping a beloved land he was about to lose, an Eden about to vanish. Her answering touch was just as desperate, her fingers tangling in his dark, thick hair, pulling him closer, pressing their bodies together until there was no space left between them, only the electric current of shared despair and undiluted desire. When their bodies pressed together, it was a silent language of need and tenderness, a rightness to it, a feeling soon of coming home that resonated deep within her bones. It was fire and fragility all at once, a dance where every sigh, every tremor, every whispered breath carried the weight of 3 years of shared life and the terror of the coming day. The coolness of the night air on their exposed skin was a stark contrast to the heat that flared between them, a feverish testament to their connection. The scent of salt from the ocean mingled with the sweet, heavy perfume of the night-blooming flowers Evelyn loved, clinging to her hair, a bitter-sweet aroma of their sanctuary. The only sounds were the soft shush of the waves, the crackle of their dying fire, and the mingled rhythm of their breathing, ragged and uneven. Their touch was a sacred anchor in a world about to be swept away, a fervent, unspoken marriage vow made in their Eden on its final night. The taste of salt, not from the sea but from their unwept tears, mingled on their lips, sealing their desperate promise. The rescue was a cacophonous assault on senses accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the tides. The blare of ship horns, the shouts of men, the blinding glare of searchlights. It was a jarring, dissonant symphony after years of wind and waves. Evelyn and Mateo, disoriented and overwhelmed, were separated almost immediately. She was whisked away, debriefed by eager officers, celebrated as Nurse Carter, a remarkable survivor. He, Corporal Ramirez, was likewise hailed, a decorated but still marginalized soldier. The starched sheets of the infirmary felt alien, the proper clothing stiff and suffocating after the freedom of their simple island wear. Every sound, every unfamiliar face was a reminder of a world that had moved on without them, a world they no longer fit into. The moment Evelyn stepped back on American soil, the invisible walls of society rose between them, stark and unyielding. Her family, tearful with relief, welcomed her back to their Boston brownstone. Their joy, however, was tinged with a polite horror at her profound, palpable connection to Mateo. Her mother, ever the pillar of Bostonian propriety, the ordeal and the need to forget, to return to her old life, her pre-war self. She spoke of suitable matches, of rebuilding a respectable future. But the girl who'd been cast ashore with Mateo, the woman who'd built a life from wreckage, was not the same one who had boarded the USS Mercy. Mateo faced his own battles. His family in Los Angeles welcomed him with boisterous relief, but the underlying currents of prejudice, the subtle slights, the unspoken expectations, remained. The world he had left, the world he had fought for, was still the same one where a man like him was judged by his name and background rather than his character. The freedom of the island, where he was simply Mateo, a man valued for his strength and ingenuity, felt like a distant, impossible dream. The pressure mounted, subtle yet relentless. Friends and family attempted to steer Evelyn back into her pre-war social circles, away from the unconventional attachment she had formed. Mateo was encouraged to rejoin his own community, to seek a future more realistic for a man of his background. The unspoken rules of the era, the societal divides, seemed insurmountable. But Evelyn and Mateo, forged in the crucible of shared survival, had found a strength within themselves that was more than a match for society's disapproval. Their love, nurtured in isolation, had grown beyond mere necessity. It was a profound choice, a radical act of defiance. They found each other again, first in hushed phone calls, then in clandestine meetings, their hands finding each other's in the crowded anonymity of train stations and bustling city streets. They chose each other not out of convenience or a shared past, but out of a love that has been tested by literal and figurative isolation, refined by hardship and deepened by an understanding that transcended class, race, and societal expectation. Weeks later they found their first moment of true privacy since the rescue, not in a grand home or a familiar room, but in a simple, anonymous boarding house in a small town where no one knew their names, where their past was their own. The world outside was loud, the jarring sounds of traffic and city life a stark contrast to the gentle shush of island waves. But in this small space, behind a locked door, they rediscovered their own quiet rhythm. The lovemaking here was different from that desperate, sorrowful surrender on the island's final night. It was less frantic, more deliberate, a tender, passionate reclamation. He traced the faint lines on her skin, the remnants of sun and sea, the indelible marks of their shared history. His fingers lingered on the calluses that had formed on her palms from weaving and gardening, those hands that had learned to build a home. Evelyn held his hand, her own fingers tracing the rough, familiar landscape of his calloused palm, feeling the strength that had saved her, the tenderness that had cherished her. It was a confirmation, deep and resonant, that their love was not an island fantasy. It was their truest reality, a portable sanctuary they could build anywhere, a love that transcended the world's expectations. Evelyn Carter, no longer bound by rules, now made them. She had shed the skin of her former self, returning to the world as a woman defined by her own courage and her unwavering heart. Mateo Ramirez, returning to America, carried not cynicism but a new, unshakable sense of self-worth anchored by Evelyn's love. He was ready to fight for his place in the world, not just as a soldier, but as a man worthy of happiness, worthy of her. They had been saved from the sea, only to find that their true rescue was from the world they had left behind. And in each other's arms, they had found an island that no ocean, no prejudice, no societal expectation could ever wash away. The single perfect seashell Evelyn kept, a tangible piece of their shared Eden, sat on their modest bedside table, a silent testament to the extraordinary love that had blossomed in the heart of their own extraordinary horizon. Romance on the Amalfi coast. The Villa Fiorenza clung to the cliffs of Positano like a lovesick ghost, its whitewashed walls stained gold by the relentless Italian sun. Below, the Tyrrhenian Sea sighed against the rocks, a constant rhythmic breath that seemed to pull the very soul out of you, leaving you bare and breathless. It was into this ancient, breathtaking beauty that Maya stepped, a well-worn leather-bound notebook clutched in her hand like a talisman against the overwhelming grandeur of it all. At 29, she had saved for years for this solo pilgrimage, a journey she hoped would finally unlock the stories trapped within her, the ones that whispered to her in the quiet moments but scattered like startled birds the moment she put pen to paper. The air thick with the intoxicating scent of lemon groves and the sharp, clean tang of salt spray felt both foreign and achingly familiar, as if she had dreamt of this place long before she'd ever seen a photograph. She felt a profound sense of displacement amidst the villa's quiet elegance. The other guests, with their confident, easy laughter and linen clothes that seemed to float on the gentle breeze, moved with a languid grace that made Maya acutely aware of her own nervous energy, her department store sundress, and the worn straps of her backpack. She first saw him on the shared terrace, a space that seemed to hang suspended between the azure sky and the glittering sea. Arthur, 45, was a study in stillness, a man who wore his solitude like a bespoke coat. He was sketching the horizon, his hand moving with a practiced, almost unconscious grace. His face handsome in a way that seemed to belong to another, more formal era, was shadowed with a melancholy that was as much a part of him as the silver at his temples. He looked up as she approached, his gaze meeting hers for a fleeting moment. He gave a polite but brief nod before returning to his work, the gesture creating an immediate, almost challenging sense of distance. He wore his solitude like a well-tailored coat, Maya wrote in her notebook later that afternoon, the words flowing with a surprising ease. Something about the stillness in him made my own restlessness feel so loud. That evening, the villa's patrons gathered for an al fresco dinner on the terrace. The long, rustic table was laden with fresh bread, glistening olive d'ors, and carafes of deep red wine. Maya, feeling awkward and out of her depth, found herself seated near Arthur. He spoke little, but when he did, his observations were sharp, tinged with a dry, almost Austen-like wit that cut through the polite chatter like a shard of sea glass. He turned to her, his blue eyes holding a surprising intensity. "And what brings you to Amalfi, Miss Maya?" she supplied, her voice a little too soft. "I'm a writer, or I'm trying to be." The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He didn't pry, but a flicker of interest, like a match struck in the twilight, crossed his face. He gestured with his wineglass towards the impossibly beautiful vista, the sky bleeding from fiery orange to a soft, bruised purple. "It's relentless, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to blend with the sound of the sea. "This beauty, it demands a response, even when one has nothing left to say." His words resonated with a truth so profound it made her shiver. It was a man who understood the tyranny of beauty, the way it could mock you with its perfection when your own world felt fractured and incomplete. She looked at the blank pages of her notebook, a symbol of both her boundless potential and her paralyzing fear, and for the first time since arriving she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps here, on this ancient coast, she would finally find the word she was looking for, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was not the only one who had come here to heal. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Maya would wake early, the scent of lemons and strong coffee, a heady perfume in the morning air. She would write, filling the pages of her notebook with descriptions of the light, the sea, the feel of the sun on her skin. And she would watch Arthur. He was a creature of habit, sketching on the terrace in the morning, disappearing for long walks in the afternoon, returning in the evening to sit with a book and a glass of whiskey, his circles a world unto itself. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, The slight tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the horizon, a look of such profound loss in them that it made her own heart ache. She was drawn to his sadness, to the quiet dignity with which he carried it. It was a grief that felt as ancient and as enduring as the cliffs themselves. One morning she dared to approach him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She held out a small plate of pastries she'd bought in the village. I thought you might like one," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. He looked up from his sketchbook, his expression unreadable. For a long moment she thought he would refuse, that she had trespassed on his carefully constructed solitude. Then a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He took a pastry, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. It was a small gesture, a simple act of kindness, but it felt like a bridge had been built between them, a fragile connection in the vast, beautiful emptiness of the Amalfi coast. And as she walked away, the scent of lemons and the memory of his touch lingering on her skin, she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that something was beginning. The labyrinthine streets of Positano, a cascade of sun-bleached pastels and bougainvillea-draped balconies, were a place where one could easily lose themselves. And Maya, with her writer's soul and a propensity for daydreaming, did just that. She had been wandering for hours, the winding cobbled alleys and steep staircases all blurring into one another, when a familiar voice cut through her flustered confusion. "Lost!" It was Arthur. He was leaning against a crumbling stone wall, a small rare smile playing on his lips. He had found her, a damsel in distress in the heart of this ancient town, and for a moment she felt a blush of embarrassment. But then he pushed himself off the wall and, with a simple chivalrous gesture, offered her his arm. "Allow me," he said, and as he guided her back towards the familiar path to the villa, he shared stories of the town's history, of the Saracen pirates and the wealthy merchants who had built their fortunes on these cliffs. His voice, usually so reserved, was filled with a quiet passion, and Maya found herself captivated, not just by the stories, but by the man telling them. The formal barrier between them, once as formidable as a fortress wall, had crumbled, leaving in its place a tentative blossoming intimacy. Their morning coffees on the terrace became a shared ritual. In the soft, golden light of the early sun, they would talk, their conversations weaving a delicate tapestry of shared thoughts and quiet confessions. He spoke of his late wife, not in detail, but with a quiet, profound grief that Maya, who had lost her mother young, understood with an intuitive ache. He spoke of a life before the grief, of a love that had been the anchor of his world, and of the hollowing emptiness it had left in its wake. She, in turn, confided in him about her modest background, about the feeling of being an outsider looking in, a theme that ran through her life like a persistent melancholic melody. "I've always felt like I was standing on the outside of life, just taking notes," she confessed one morning, the taste of strong Italian coffee sharp on her tongue. "I'm not sure how to step inside." He didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply listened, his gaze steady and unwavering, and in his silence she felt a sense of being truly seen, of being understood in a way she never had before. One afternoon he led her down a steep, winding flight of stone steps, a hidden path that seemed to descend into the very heart of the cliffs. At the bottom, a small secret cove opened up before them. A crescent of smooth grey pebbles lapped by the impossibly turquoise water. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a secluded paradise hidden from the world. They spent the afternoon there, swimming in the cool, clear water and talking for hours. The physical isolation created a bubble of intimacy, a world of their own where the rules of the outside world, the unspoken hierarchies of class and experience, seemed to fade away. He asked to see her notebook, and with a trembling hand she passed it to him. He read a passage she'd written about the sea, her words a raw, honest reflection of its power and its mystery. When he looked up, his eyes were shining with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You have an eye for the truth of things," he said, his voice a low caress. A clarity I thought I'd lost forever. The compliment landed with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her dizzy with a strange, intoxicating mix of pride and longing. The air between them crackled with unspoken attraction, a current of electricity that was as palpable as the heat of the sun on their skin. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "It's as if she's coaxing the colour back into my faded photograph of a life," he thought, watching her as she wrote in her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was a splash of vibrant colour in his monochrome world, a melody in his silent grief. The worn, softened pages of Maya's notebook, once a symbol of her fear and her potential, were now filling with a new story, a story inspired by the man who sat beside her, his presence a steady, comforting warmth. The scent of lemons had been replaced by the salty tang of the sea on his skin, the blank pages now filled with dialogue that echoed his wit, his wisdom, his quiet, aching sadness. The sound of the sea against the cliffs was no longer a lonely sigh, but a chorus to the burgeoning love story that was being written, line by line, on the sun-drenched shores of the Amalfi coast. And in the quiet intimacy of their secret cove, under the watchful gaze of the ancient cliffs, they were no longer two strangers, but two souls who had found in each other a reflection of their own deepest longings, their own most secret truths. The deepening had begun, a slow, inevitable tide pulling them closer, and in the heart of this Italian summer, a love story as timeless and as beautiful as the coast itself was beginning to bloom. The invitation arrived on a slip of heavy cream-coloured cardstock, the elegant script a stark contrast to Maya's humble notebook. Arthur had been invited to a soirée at a neighbouring luxury hotel in Ravello by old family friends, and on a whim, a sudden impulsive desire to share his world with her, he had asked Maya to accompany him. She was both thrilled and terrified, a giddy, fluttering excitement warring with a deep, sinking sense of inadequacy. What would she wear? What would she say? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, threatening to devour her newfound confidence. She settled on a simple black dress, the only thing in her meagre wardrobe that seemed even remotely appropriate. But as she stood beside Arthur in the lobby of the opulent hotel, the discordant sound of clinking champagne flutes and brittle laughter echoing around them, she felt like a crow in a flock of peacocks. Arthur, in a bespoke suit that seemed to be an extension of his own effortless elegance, was greeted by a stream of impossibly chic wealthy Europeans who spoke of yachts and winters in St. Moritz, their conversation a foreign language that Maya could not comprehend. She saw him slip back into a life she could not imagine, a world of inherited wealth and casual glamour that was a universe away from her own. He was gracious, attentive, introducing her to his friends with a warm, possessive hand on the small of her back. But as he was pulled into a conversation with a silver-haired man with a booming laugh and a Rolex that glinted under the crystal chandeliers, Maya found herself adrift in a sea of strangers. A woman with a diamond necklace that could have paid off Maya's student loans turned to her, her smile a masterpiece of condescending politeness. "And what is it you do?" she asked, her tone implying that any answer Maya could give would be utterly inconsequential. "I'm trying to be a writer," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. The words, once a source of pride, now felt pathetic, a childish dream in the face of this glittering adult reality. The woman's smile widened, a flicker of pity in her eyes, before she turned away, dismissing Maya with a flick of her perfectly manicured hand. Arthur, momentarily distracted by his hosts, didn't see the exchange. But Maya felt it like a physical blow, a confirmation of all her deepest fears. She was an outsider, charming, rustic diversion for a man who belonged to a world she could never be a part of. The feeling of abandonment, of being left behind, was a familiar ache, a ghost from a childhood spent feeling second best. Later that night, back at the villa, the tension on the terrace was as thick and as suffocating as the humid night air. The romantic, hazy atmosphere that had once enveloped them had been pierced by the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. Maya, hurt and insecure, pulled away from Arthur's touch, her body stiff with a pain he couldn't understand. "I don't belong in that world, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "It was foolish of me to pretend I ever could." Arthur, stung by her withdrawal, misinterpreted her words as a rejection of his world, and by extension, a rejection of him. He had offered her a glimpse into his life, and she had thrown it back in his face, the shutters of his grief and solitude, which had begun to open to let in the light, slammed shut with a deafening finality. "Was it so terrible then?" he asked, his voice clipped and cold, the warmth that had begun to thaw his frozen heart now gone, replaced by an icy distance. "To be a part of my life for one evening?" The words hung between them, a chasm of misunderstanding that neither of them knew how to cross. The chill of the night air on the terrace was nothing compared to the coldness that had settled between them, a rift that seemed as deep and as unbridgeable as the sea itself. The sight of Arthur's bespoke suit, which had once seemed so elegant, now looked like armour, a shield against a world, and a woman he was no longer sure he wanted to let in. The whispers of Amalfi, once so full of promise, had fallen silent, and in their place a storm was gathering, threatening to tear them apart. The storm broke with a theatrical, almost biblical fury. It rolled in from the sea, a churning mass of black clouds that swallowed the stars and plunged the coast into a primal darkness. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the ancient stones of the villa, and the rain came down in sheets, a relentless, percussive assault against the windows. The power flickered, died, and then plunged them into a sudden, intimate darkness, broken only by the flickering glow of a few hastily lit candles. The storm, in its wild, untamed fury, forced a proximity they had been avoiding for days. Maya, her bags packed, had been about to leave, to flee the island and the man who had broken her heart without even trying. She found Arthur on his balcony, a silhouette against the violent electric sky, watching the lightning tear jagged, silver scars across the clouds. "I was just leaving," she said, her voice small against the roar of the storm. He turned, his face illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning, and she saw in his eyes a raw, unguarded pain that mirrored her own. "Don't go," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. And then, as the storm raged around them, the confession came, a torrent of words that had been dammed up for years. He spoke of his wife's death, not the sanitized, socially acceptable version he offered to acquaintances, but the real, brutal truth of it. He spoke of a long, debilitating illness that had stolen her from him piece by piece, leaving him a helpless spectator to her slow, agonizing fade. He spoke of the gilded cage of his wealth, the way it had isolated him in his grief, trapping him in a world of well-meaning but ultimately useless sympathy. He confessed that he hadn't been ashamed of her at the party. He had been terrified. Terrified of letting someone new into the fragile, carefully constructed world he had built around his grief. Terrified of feeling again, of loving again, of losing again. His raw, unvarnished vulnerability shattered Maya's pride, washing away the hurt and the anger, leaving in their place a profound, aching empathy. She saw not a privileged man, but a lonely one, a man who'd been drowning in a sea of silent sorrow. She crossed the balcony, the wind whipping her hair around her face, and took his hand. It was cold, trembling. "I was scared too," she confessed, her voice thick with tears. She told him of her own deep-seated fear of not being enough, a wound from a childhood spent in the shadow of a more beautiful, more brilliant older sister. She told him of the constant gnawing feeling that she was a fraud, a pretender, a woman whose life was too small, too insignificant to ever truly matter. The emotional honesty between them became an undeniable force, a current of electricity that was even more powerful than the storm raging around them. He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of him, the scent of rain and ozone and a sorrow that was so deep it felt like her own. He led her inside into the flickering candlelight of his suite. The world outside had been reduced to the sound of the rain lashing against the windows and the frantic, syncopated rhythm of their own hearts. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch exquisitely gentle, a silent promise of comfort, of understanding, of a shared and sacred space where all their broken pieces were welcome. He leaned in, and the first kiss was soft, questioning, tasting of salt and sorrow. It deepened as their defences crumbled, as the last vestiges of their pride and their fear were washed away by the rising tide of their need. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest, an ache that was no longer about pain, but about a longing so profound it felt like it could shatter her into a million pieces. His hands traced her back, drawing shivers that left her breathless, his touch a silent language that spoke of a reverence that bordered on worship. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh, every moan seemed to carry a lifetime of unspoken longing for connection. Clothes fell away, a whisper of fabric against skin in the heated rush of their desire. He laid her down on the cool sheets of his bed, the candlelight flickering on her skin, turning it to liquid gold. He moved over her, his body a warm, solid weight that anchored her in the storm of her own passion. Their movements began to synchronize, a silent understanding passing between them, reverently his eyes locked on hers, a silent question that she answered with an arch of her back, a gasp of pure, unadulterated pleasure. The act was a slow, reverent discovery, a silent language that said everything words could not. It was a physical affirmation of their emotional breakthrough, a healing union that was not about lust, but about seeing and being seen, about finding in each other a solace, a sanctuary, a home. As the storm outside began to subside, a new storm, a storm of passion and release, broke within them, a tempest of shared pleasure that left them breathless, sated, and finally, irrevocably, whole. They woke in each other's arms as dawn broke, painting the sea in hues of rose and gold. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a world washed clean, a world that felt new and bright and full of possibility. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with a comfortable, profound intimacy, a shared language of soft breaths and gentle touches. Maya unpacked her bag, the act a quiet, symbolic reversal of her intended flight. She watched as Arthur, for the first time since she had met him, took out his old sketchbook and began a new drawing. But he wasn't sketching the horizon, the sea, or the cliffs. He was sketching her as she sat in the morning light, her notebook open on her lap, and for the first time she wasn't staring at a blank page. The words were pouring out of her, a torrent of emotion, of observation, of a story that was no longer trapped inside her, but flowing freely, joyfully, onto the page. Later that day, they returned to their secret cove, the place where their story had truly begun. The sun was warm on their skin, the water a glittering, inviting turquoise. He didn't offer her a life in a glittering world of yachts and St. Moritz. He offered her something far more precious, far more real. He offered her himself just as he was, a man scarred by grief but healed by love. He suggested they could divide their time between her world and his, building something new together, a life that was not defined by class or by circumstance, but by the shared geography of their hearts. He asked to read what she had written, and she handed him the notebook, no longer afraid. He read her words, his eyes shining with a pride and a love that was so profound it took her breath away. He saw her, not as a woman who was trying to be a writer, but as a writer, a storyteller, a woman who had found her voice. On the secluded beach, their special place, the world was reduced to 3 elements: the impossible blue of the sky, the glittering turquoise of the sea, and the radiant heat of the sun. He kissed her slowly, with the warmth of the morning sun in his touch, a kiss that tasted of hope, of new beginnings, of a future that was as bright and as boundless as the sea itself. There, in the privacy of their hidden cove, the last of their barriers fell away. With gentle, unhurried movements, they shed their clothes, letting them pool on the sun-warmed pebbles. To be naked before him in the full, unforgiving light of day was a vulnerability far greater than any confession whispered in the dark. Yet as his eyes roamed over her, she felt no shame, only a profound sense of being seen, truly and completely, for the first time in her life. His gaze was not one of mere possession, but of reverence, as if he were memorizing every curve, every freckle, every pale inch of her skin as a cartographer might map a beautiful undiscovered country. She reached for him, her fingers tracing the hard planes of his chest, the faint scars on his shoulders that told stories of a life lived before her. Their bodies, dusted with fine sand that glittered like crushed diamonds in the sun, came together with a soft sigh of homecoming. He laid her back on a blanket spread over the smooth sandy shore, the gentle lapping of the waves a constant soothing rhythm beside them. This was not a desperate search for shelter in a storm, but a joyful dance in the sunshine. His hands explored her with a playful tenderness, his touch light and teasing, coaxing soft laughter from her lips. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the sensitive skin of her inner arm, the curve of her hip, each touch a deliberate, sun-drenched punctuation mark in the new story they were writing. When he finally moved over her, his body shielding her from the direct intensity of the sun, she wrapped her legs around him, pulling him closer. His movement found the rhythm of the tide itself, a slow, patient pulling and releasing that was both deeply grounding and utterly transcendent. Each deliberate motion was an act of reverence. The sheer pleasure of his slowness was a sweet, deep, piercing wave that built within her, honouring the long journey they had taken to arrive in this single, perfect moment. Her head fell back against the soft sand, her moans lost in the sound of the surf. The heat was immense, from the sun above, the sand below, and the friction of their bodies moving together in a dance as ancient as the cliffs that watched over them. She looked up at his face, his expression one of intense, focused pleasure. His eyes closed as if savouring every sensation. She reached up to cup his jaw and he opened his eyes, their gazes locking in a moment of such raw intimacy that it stole her breath. There were no more secrets, no more shadows. There was only this heat, this light, this undeniable truth of 2 souls becoming one under the vast Italian sky. Their pace quickened, the gentle rhythm building to a powerful, crashing crescendo. It was a release that was not just physical, but emotional, a joyous, shared explosion of all the love, the longing, and the hope they had found in each other. It was a celebration, a physical manifestation of the union of their souls. It was not a collision of 2 broken people, but the partnership of 2 whole souls choosing each other, who had chosen to write their next chapter together. Afterward, they lay tangled in each other's arms, their skin slick with sweat and glowing in the afternoon light. He brushed a stray piece of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. In that tender silence, with the sound of the waves as their only witness, the grand panorama of the Amalfi coast seemed to shrink, replaced by the infinite landscape they found in each other's eyes. It was a discovery made not in words, but in the profound peace of that single touch. And so, on a coast built from ancient stone and timeless sunlight, they discovered that the most beautiful view is not the one overlooking the sea, but the one you see reflected in the eyes of the person who chose to write their next chapter with you. They had both come to Amalfi seeking solace, seeking inspiration, seeking a way to heal their broken hearts. And in the whispers of the wind and the waves, in the scent of lemons and the warmth of the sun, they had found something more. They had found each other, and in finding each other, they had found themselves. Waves of Montauk. The Finch estate did not so much sit upon the cliffs of Montauk as it did cling to them, a great grey-shingled beast braced against the perpetual assault of the Atlantic. It arrived in Brienne Vance's life through a fine salt mist, looking less like a home and more like a fortress against the world. In late August the air was heavy with the coming autumn, a damp chill that promised an end to things. For Brienne, an ending was precisely what she sought. At 28, her life felt like a book left open in the rain, its ink bleeding into an illegible future. A quiet heartbreak, the kind that doesn't scream but suffocates, had left her adrift. The position, cataloguing a private library for a reclusive billionaire, was a life raft, a chance to immerse herself in the ordered silence of other people's stories until she could make sense of her own. The front door, a monstrous thing of salt-bleached oak and rusted iron, was opened by a woman as severe and unyielding as the house itself. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, had a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice devoid of welcome, "you're punctual. Mr. Finch values punctuality above all else, save for privacy." She led Brienne through a cavernous hall where the air was thick with the scent of old paper, lemon oil, and the ever-present briny tang of the ocean. The low roar of the waves against the cliffs below was a constant sonorous heartbeat. It was the sound of isolation. "Your duties are confined to the library," Mrs. Gable stated, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm on the stone floors. "Your quarters are in the east wing. Meals will be taken there. The master is not to be disturbed. He keeps his own counsel and his own hours. You will find that respecting the silence of this house is paramount." Brienne merely nodded, her own quiet nature finding a strange comfort in the prescribed solitude. This was not a house for laughter. It was a place for whispers, for thoughts held deep in the chest. Alistair Finch was waiting for them in the library, though waiting seemed too active a word. He stood before a towering window that looked out upon the churning grey sea, a tall, severe silhouette against the bruised sky. When he turned, Brienne felt the full weight of his presence. He was 42, but a harsh grief had etched itself into the lines around his eyes and mouth, making him appear older. His hair was dark, shot through with silver at the temples, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble, unused to the rhythms of casual conversation. "Miss Vance." He did not offer a hand. His gaze flickered over her for a moment before fixing on a distant point over the sea, as if she were a minor disturbance in his vast, empty horizon. "Mr. Finch," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "Mrs. Gable has explained the terms." "She has." "Good." He gestured vaguely to the room around them. It was magnificent, a 2-story cathedral of books, its towering shelves connected by a spiralling iron staircase. Dust motes danced in the few beams of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating a state of profound chaos. Books were stacked on floors, spilling from chairs, their spines cracked and their pages yellowed. It was a beautiful ruin. "The books are the only part of this house that still breathe," Alistair said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Do not disturb them more than necessary." And with that, he was gone. leaving Brienne in the echoing silence of the room. A strange sentiment, she thought, to speak of books as living things yet to preside over a house that felt so utterly funereal. She took a deep breath, the scent of decaying paper filling her lungs like a forgotten perfume. She ran her fingers along a row of leather-bound volumes, the texture a comfort beneath her fingertips. This was her world. Here, amidst the ghosts of forgotten worlds, she knew the language. Her eyes landed on a worn dark green binding, wedged between two larger tomes. Gently she worked it free. A first edition of Jane Eyre. The corners were softened from use, the spine lovingly worn. She opened it, and the scent of time itself rose from its pages. Holding it in her hands, she felt a profound sense of kinship, not just with the novel's plain and passionate heroine, but with the very room itself. It was a place that understood secrets, that held sorrow in its bones. He speaks as if the house itself is on life support, and this room is its only lung, she thought, tracing the title on the cover. I feel as if I'm cataloguing a man's soul, not just his shelves. The single beam of light that cut through the dusty library window began its slow descent, painting a stripe of gold across the floor. Outside, the ocean roared its endless, lonely song. For the first time in months, Brienne felt a flicker of something that was not grief, it was purpose. The days shortened as August bled into September. The relentless Montauk sun softened, its light taking on the golden, melancholic hue of memory. The library, once a tomb of chaotic history, was slowly yielding its secrets to Brienne's patient hands. She imposed order with a gentle touch, her system of cataloguing both methodical and intuitive. The house remained a bastion of silence, but it was a silence that Brienne was beginning to learn. It was not empty, but full of things unsaid. Alistair began to haunt the edges of her work. At first he would appear at the doorway, a fleeting shadow, observing her progress before vanishing as silently as he came. Then he started to linger. He would pull a book from a shelf she had yet to reach, his large hands surprisingly careful as he turned its brittle pages. His comments were terse, yet startlingly insightful. "That edition of Melville," he murmured one afternoon, not looking at her, "contains a misprint in the 3rd chapter. My great-grandfather circled it in pencil. He believed imperfections were a sign of humanity." He spoke as if to the book itself, but the words were for her. The evenings were the most potent. One night, too engrossed to notice the time, Brienne had worked until the room was steeped in shadow. A chill had settled in the air, and she'd taken a thick woolen blanket from her chest and wrapped it around her shoulders, stepping out onto the sprawling stone porch that overlooked the ocean. The moon was a silver coin tossed into a black velvet sky, its light shimmering on the restless water. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt his presence beside her, a sudden density in the air. He held 2 steaming mugs. He offered one to her and their fingers brushed, a brief electric contact that startled them both. "Tea," he said, his voice softer in the darkness. "Mrs. Gable insists the night air is treacherous." "Thank you." She cupped the mug, its warmth seeping into her cold hands. They stood in a companionable silence that felt worlds away from the strained formality of their first encounters. For the first time they spoke of something other than books. He talked about the tides, the inexorable pull of the moon, the language of the waves. She spoke of her childhood in the Midwest, of flat lands and vast skies, a life lived as far from the sea as one could get. It was a cautious exchange of geographies, a mapping of the landscapes that had shaped them. Her most significant discovery came a week later, tucked away in a small locked secretary desk. After some hesitation, Alistair had given her the key. Inside she found not business ledgers, but a hidden collection of books on botany. They were filled with pressed flowers, violets, sea lavender, wild roses, each one carefully preserved, their colours faded to gentle ghosts. Beside them, in elegant looping script, were handwritten notes on soil, sunlight, and bloom times. They were signed Eleonora Finch, Alistair's mother. It was a glimpse into a softer, more poetic side of the family legacy, a tenderness that seemed to defy the severe architecture of the house and its master. When she showed him, Alistair's face was a mask, but she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. He traced the outline of a pressed Queen Anne's lace with his index finger. She believed anything could grow here, with enough patience. The real turning point came on a cool evening, the scent of an impending rainstorm carried on the wind. Brienne was sorting through a collection of sheet music, humming a sad, simple classical melody under her breath. Alistair, who had been reading by the fire, suddenly went still. The book in his lap lay forgotten. "Where did you learn that tune?" he asked, his voice strained. "Oh, it's a piece by Satie. I'm sorry, I didn't realise I was humming so loudly." He shook his head, his gaze lost in the flickering flames. "It was my wife's favourite." It was the first time he had ever mentioned her. The words hung between them heavy and fragile, a shard of glass in the air. The silence that followed was different. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of shared sorrow. Brienne looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the formidable billionaire, but a man encased in loss. Later that night, unable to sleep, she returned to the library. He was there, standing by the great window, watching the first drops of rain begin to streak the glass. "I think a person's library is a sort of autobiography," she said softly, breaking the quiet. "This one tells a story of great passion and great sorrow." He didn't turn, but his shoulders seemed to slump. Watching her move through the silent house, touching the books with a tenderness he had forgotten was possible, Alistair felt a dangerous crack appear in the fortress he had built around his heart. She moved through the silence of this house like a melody, one he was beginning to realise he did not want to end. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke, unleashing a week of relentless, driving rain. The sky turned a bruised purple-grey, and the Atlantic raged, its waves crashing against the cliffs with a percussive fury that shook the very foundations of the house. The Finch estate no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a ship tossed at sea, its inhabitants trapped within its groaning walls. The charged intimacy that had begun to blossom between Brianna and Alistair soured, curdling into a tense and claustrophobic silence. The past arrived, as it always does, uninvited and cruel. It came not as a ghost, but as a digital headline. While researching a publisher's history, Brienne stumbled upon an old sensationalized article from a New York Society column. The words leaped from the screen, stark and merciless. "Finch divorce turns vicious. Wife accuses billionaire of emotional glacier." The article dredged up the entire sordid affair. The bitter divorce, the public accusations of emotional neglect, a wife who painted him as a cold, unfeeling monolith, incapable of human connection, all amplified by a merciless press. Reading it, Brienne felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. It wasn't the scandal that shocked her. It was the sudden, brutal clarity. The fortress, the silence, the retreat from the world, it was not arrogance. It was a wound, deep and septic. Feeling the ghost of that public evisceration closing in, Alistair retreated completely. The fragile bridge they had built between them crumbled. He became cold, distant, his formality returning with a sharp, cutting edge. He was once again Mr. Finch, the employer, and she was Miss Vance, the librarian. The easy conversations on the porch, the shared warmth of tea mugs, the quiet understanding in the library, it all vanished, swept away by the storm. He began to find fault in her work. A book misplaced by an inch, a catalogue entry he deemed too descriptive. He was looking for a reason to push her away, and his search was desperate. The breaking point came in the library, the very room that had been their sanctuary. She had found him staring at the botany books, his expression dark. When he saw her, his face hardened. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said, his voice flat. "Seen what?" she asked, though she knew. "The articles. The public record of my failings." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "I imagine it provides quite the context for your work here. A fascinating case study." Brienne flinched. "That's not what I think." "Isn't it?" he snapped, turning on her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire she'd never seen. "You look at me with that pity, that gentle, understanding sympathy. I do not want your pity, Miss Vance." "It isn't pity," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's called empathy. Perhaps you've read of it in one of these books." The cruelty of her retort surprised them both. His face went pale. "I hired you to catalogue my books, Miss Vance, not my history," he said, his voice now lethally quiet. "You're not qualified for that." The words struck her like a physical blow. In that moment, a book she had been holding slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. Its pages splayed across the Persian rug like the broken wings of a wounded bird. Neither of them moved to pick it up. The space between them crackled with hurt and misunderstanding. She turned and walked out of the room, the bone-deep chill that had seeped into the house now settling permanently in her heart. Back in her room, she began to pack her personal items, her movements stiff and mechanical. It was foolish to think the silence in this house was peace, she thought, folding a sweater with numb fingers. It was grief held under pressure. And I, with my clumsy hands, have just broken the seal. The silence that fell between them now was heavier than before. It was no longer a space of things unsaid, but of things that could never be unsaid. It was as loud and violent as the roaring ocean outside. Her work was nearly done. She would finish quickly and she would leave. On what was meant to be her last night, the storm reached its zenith. A furious, primal howl of wind and water, it threw itself against the house with the force of a battering ram. Sometime after 10, with a final protesting groan, the estate's generators gave out. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into an absolute suffocating darkness. The roar of the storm was now the only thing in the world. Emergency lanterns flickered to life in the hallways, casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar spaces into something alien and menacing. The road would be flooded, impassable. Brienne was trapped. She found herself, as if drawn by an unseen force, back in the library. The fire was the only source of warmth and light, its flames painting the room in shades of blood and gold. Her bags, partially packed, sat by the door, a testament to her failed escape. She sank into an armchair before the hearth, pulling a blanket around her, and watched the fire wage its small, defiant war against the overwhelming dark. She didn't know how long she sat there before he appeared in the doorway, a tall silhouette framed by the dim lantern light from the hall. Alistair. He saw her, then his gaze dropped to the bags. The formidable armour he wore seemed to flake away in the flickering light, leaving only the raw, wounded man beneath. He walked slowly into the room, the darkness stripping away all their pretences, all their carefully constructed defences. He stopped before her, the firelight catching the profound exhaustion on his face. "I am sorry," he said. The words were not the easy apology of a gentleman. They were ripped from him, raw and ragged, with an emotion he could no longer contain. "What I said to you, it was cruel, and it was born of cowardice." Brienne said nothing, merely watched him, her heart a painful knot in her chest. "For 5 years," he continued, his voice cracking, "I have lived in this mausoleum, convincing myself that solitude was strength, that feeling nothing was a kind of peace." He looked around the great shadowed room. "My wife, she never saw me. She saw a name, a fortune, a stern facade, as the papers so gleefully quoted, to be used for her own ambitions. When she was done with me, she dismantled me piece by piece in front of the entire world. I let her. He finally looked at Brienne, his eyes dark pools of anguish. I am not afraid of the world, Miss Vance. I am afraid of letting anyone close enough to hold the chisel again. I am terrified of being seen. The confession hung in the air, vulnerable and absolute. In that moment, Brienne's own hurt dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. She stood letting the blanket fall away. "I know what it is to be a ghost in your own life," she whispered, her own confession a fragile offering. "I came to Montauk to escape the memory of a man who looked at me every day but never truly saw me. I was a comfortable habit he was not yet ready to break." Their shared brokenness became the bridge across the darkness. He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing right before her. The air was electric, thick with years of unspoken longing, his for connection, hers for recognition. He reached for her, his touch so hesitant at first, his calloused fingers barely grazing her cheek. Then, as if her stillness gave him courage, his hand cupped her face, his thumb stroking her skin. It was a gesture of such desperate tenderness that it broke her. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of surrender, of desperation, a tasting of salt and sorrow, and the storm that raged both outside and within them. Her hands came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him as the world spun away. It was a collision, a breaking point. His mouth was hungry, his body trembling with a need that had been starved for years. His hands moved from her face down her neck, over her shoulders, mapping the lines of her as if to memorize her by touch in the near darkness. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in ragged gasps. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howling wind. "Brienne," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. Without another word, he began to unbutton her blouse. His fingers were clumsy with haste and reverence. The clothes were shared not in a frantic rush, but with a sense of sacred ritual. Each layer removed a wall torn down. The firelight licked at their skin, casting their entwined shadows onto the bookshelves behind them, making them a part of the library's living story. Skin met skin in a heated shock that stole what little breath they had left. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the thick Persian rug before the fire, laying her down gently. He looked down at her, his eyes burning with an intensity that was both terrifying and beautiful. He was seeing her, all of her. When he moved to cover her body with his, it was with a reverence that bordered on worship. His mouth found the hollow of her throat, the curve of her collarbone, tasting her sin as if she were the first drop of rain after a decade of drought. Her gasp turned into a soft moan as his hand slid lower, exploring her with a mixture of reverence and raw hunger. He found the wet, hot centre of her, and she cried out, arching into his touch. He positioned himself between her legs, the heat of him a promise. As their bodies aligned, a deep, powerful glide that sheathed him in her warmth. It was a feeling of being utterly filled, of being anchored in a storm. A flood of pure sensation washed over her, a stream of consciousness of touch and heat and pressure. The slow, powerful rhythm of his body moving with hers. The solid weight of him, the scent of wood smoke in his skin. He moved with a control that was rapidly fraying, his breath coming in harsh pants against her ear. "So alive," he whispered, the words swallowed by a clap of thunder. "God, you're so alive." Her own control shattered, her body moving with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. It was a dance of desperation and healing, of two broken halves forging themselves into a temporary whole. The climax, when it came, was a cataclysmic wave that mirrored the storm outside, a violent, shuddering release that left them clinging to each other, slick with sweat and spent passion, their moans swallowed by the tempest. The thunder receded, and in the sudden stillness, the only sound was the frantic beating of two hearts and the soft, steady crackle of the fire. Brianne awoke to a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale watercolour blue and an air so crisp and clear it felt like the first day of creation. She was tangled in sheets, not on the rug before the fire, but in Alistair's vast bed, the room filled with the gentle morning light. The ocean outside, once a roaring beast, was now calm, its waves making a soft, shushing sound against the shore. Alistair was not beside her, and for a fleeting, panicked moment, she thought the night had been a dream, a hallucination born of darkness and desperation. Then the bedroom door opened, and he entered, carrying a silver tray. On it was a pot of coffee, fresh cream, and a plate of toast. It was an act of such simple, profound domesticity that it felt more intimate than the raw passion of the night before. He set the tray on the bedside table and smiled at her, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and erased years of harshness. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, warm murmur. "Good morning," she replied, her voice husky with sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, and they drank their coffee in a comfortable silence, the barriers between them completely gone. They talked easily, about everything and nothing. The storm, the books, the way the light hit the water. It was as if the tempest had swept away all the debris of their past, leaving only this clean, quiet space for them to begin anew. "I don't want you to go," he said finally, his gaze direct and vulnerable. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I know your work is done, but I was hoping you might stay," he faltered, searching for the right words. "Not as my librarian, as something more." He didn't have the word for it, but his eyes, clear and steady, asked the question. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slipped out of bed, pulling on one of his cashmere robes that felt sinfully soft against her skin. She took his hand and led him from the bedroom, down the grand staircase and into the sun-drenched library. The room no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a repository of hope. She led him to the secretary desk and took out the botany books filled with his mother's pressed flowers. "Your mother had a gift," she said softly, opening a book to a page with a perfectly preserved wild rose. She knew how to nurture beautiful things in a place that seems so harsh. This whole estate, it's been waiting. Not just the books, the grounds. They're a legacy of love left to wither. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with an idea. "We could start a new garden." The suggestion hung in the air, a seed of possibility. It wasn't just about planting flowers. It was about cultivating a life. It was a promise. Alistair looked from the faded flowers in the book to her vibrant, earnest face and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was its living, breathing heart, and she was the one who had restarted it. Later that afternoon, with sunlight streaming through the tall bedroom windows, he showed her just how alive he felt. This time their coming together was not about desperate need, but about joyful rediscovery. It was slow, playful, filled with soft laughter that mingled with their kisses. In the clear light of day, they explored each other's bodies, not as strangers in a storm, but as partners in a newfound peace. His fingers traced the faint scar on her knee. She traced the lines on his palms. It was an intimacy of smiles and shared futures whispered against sun-warmed skin. He laid her back against the pillows, the light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden sprites. He moved over her, his body a familiar, welcome weight. Their lovemaking was a languid, luxurious dance, a celebration of the simple, miraculous fact that they had found each other. It was a promise sealed not in darkness and thunder, but in sunlight and serenity. The now gentle, rhythmic sound of the placid ocean provided the only soundtrack they needed. And so, in the house by the sea, the librarian finished her work. Not by closing a final catalogue, but by opening the first page of a new story, one whose ending they would write together, line by line, season by season, in the ink of shared days and whispered nights. The garden was waiting. Whispers of the Hollow Star. The town of Havenwood was a place that clung to the earth. It smelled of damp soil after a summer shower, of pine needles baked by the sun, and, in the case of Cale's garage, of oil, hot metal, and ozone. The garage sat at the edge of town, a corrugated steel box where the mundane dramas of failing transmissions and worn brake pads played out. It was a fortress of grit and grime, a perfect hiding place for a fallen prince nursing the wounds of a shattered cosmos. Into this world of tangible things, Nova Wren sputtered, her vintage mint-green scooter sighing its last breath at the threshold. She was a creature of the intangible, a doctoral candidate in astrophysics whose mind lived trillions of miles away in the silent waltz of distant galaxies. Her hair was a chaotic knot, a pencil stuck through it like an axis pin, and her eyes, the colour of a hazy dusk, were wide with the frustration of being violently returned to Earth. She saw him emerge from the cavernous dark of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag that seemed to have long ago surrendered to the grease. He was all sharp angles and lean muscle, clad in a faded black t-shirt and jeans that bore the stains of his trade like a second skin. But it was the details that snagged the breath in her throat. From the collar of his shirt, intricate tattoos coiled down his arms, spirals and lines that looked less like ink and more like captured starlight, forming constellations she had never seen catalogued in any atlas, terrestrial or celestial. His hands were stained dark, yet his eyes held the deep, silent, unending expanse of a moonless night sky. Broke down! His voice was a low rumble, like stones settling deep underground. It would appear its terrestrial journey has concluded, Nova murmured, her cheeks flushing. It usually gives a warning, a sort of pathetic little cough. Today it was just silence. It was absurd. One look at him, and the carefully catalogued constellations in her head felt incomplete, as if he were a missing part of the map. He moved toward the scooter, his presence a strange magnetic field that made the air feel thick. As he leaned over to inspect the engine, she stepped aside and the back of his hand brushed against hers. A jolt, sharp and clean as a lightning strike, passed between them. For Nova, the world dissolved into a dizzying flash of silver light, the air filled with a sound like wind chimes struck by a meteor shower. For Kyle, it was agony, a psychic echo brutal and unwelcome of a sunlit plaza, a woman with hair like spun silver, and a grief so profound it had once shattered a star system. He recoiled, a sharp hiss of breath escaping his lips. He masked it as a reaction to a hot engine part, but his knuckles were white where he gripped a wrench. "Sorry," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Static." But Nova knew it wasn't static. She had felt it, a current of pure, unadulterated information, a story without words. She watched, mesmerized as he worked. His movements were not those of a simple mechanic. They were precise, economical, and imbued with a grace that seemed at odds with his gritty surroundings. He didn't just diagnose the problem, he seemed to commune with the machine, his long fingers tracing wires and pipes with an intuition that was almost supernatural. The low, discordant hum of the broken engine became, under his touch, a steady, purring thrum. Finding her voice, she tried to fill the charged silence. "I was just on my way up to the ridge, to watch the Perseids." She gestured vaguely upward. "My rooftop is good, but the light pollution. You miss the faint ones." He didn't look up, his focus absolute. "Everyone looks at the stars. It's looking back that's the problem." The words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning she couldn't grasp, an unsettling wisdom that had no place next to a rack of tire irons. She pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, feeling the need to connect this man of earth and metal to her world of light and gas. Some ancient cultures believed falling stars weren't rock, but tears, she mused aloud, her voice soft. Or messages. Imagine being so important, so loved, that the heavens wept for you. He froze, the wrench in his hand stilled. He slowly straightened up, turning to face her. The deep space in his eyes was no longer quiet. It was haunted. A storm was gathering in their depths, a tempest of ancient pain. He looked at her as if she had just spoken the name of a ghost, a name he'd spent centuries trying to forget. The scent of rain on the hot asphalt outside mingled with the sharp, clean smell of ozone that seemed to cling to his very skin. And in that moment, Nova Wren felt the solid ground of her scientific world begin to crumble, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling sense of cosmic wonder. He was the secret the night sky had been keeping, and she had just stumbled upon it. The dreams began that night. They were not the usual anxiety-fueled rambles of a PhD student, but vivid, hyper-realistic fragments of a life not her own. Nova walked through cities of living crystal that sang in the light of a binary sun. She heard a language that felt not like sound, but like pure emotion poured directly into her soul. And in every dream, there was a profound, aching grief for a woman with hair of spun silver, a woman she'd never met but missed with the force of a physical wound. Watching over it all from a balcony of obsidian, or the prow of a light ship, were Cale's eyes. Not as they were in the garage, guarded and shadowed, but brighter, blazing with a power that shaped the very starlight around him. She awoke each morning with the ghost of tears on her cheeks and the scent of ozone in her nostrils. The tidy, logical world of her apartment, with its stacks of books and meticulously drawn star charts, felt like a foreign country. The universe she studied through lenses and data was now a place she had seemingly walked in her sleep. 2 days later, she found herself back at the garage. The official reason was a follow-up on the scooter, a machine now running with a perfection it had never known. The real reason stood under the glare of the work lights, his celestial tattoos a stark, beautiful mystery against his skin. "It's running perfectly," she said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. Too perfectly, and he merely nodded, his gaze steady. "I tuned the resonance manifold. They fall out of alignment easily." Resonance manifold. There was no such part on her scooter. She let it go. "I've been having the strangest dreams," she began, the words spilling out before she could stop them. She described the crystal spires, the music, the feeling of loss. She didn't dare mention his presence in them. But then, compelled by an instinct she couldn't name, she added, "And there was this image, a star that was collapsing but into itself. It was dark on the inside, a hollow star." The heavy wrench in Kael's hand slipped, clattering to the concrete floor with a deafening clang. He stared at her, the blood draining from his face. The gruff mechanic was gone, replaced by something ancient and raw. He looked flayed open, his soul exposed. The hollow star was not a dream. It was the name of his sin, the celestial tombstone of his making. Later that evening he appeared at her apartment. He brought a peace offering, A small, intricate gear he had machined from a block of stainless steel, its teeth cut with impossible precision. It was cool and heavy in her palm, a piece of his world offered to hers. "For the resonance manifold," he said, his excuse flimsy. She let him in. Her small living room, fragrant with the scent of chamomile tea and old paper, seemed to shrink around his presence. The conversation was stilted at first, dancing around the edges of the chasm that had opened between them. He spoke of running, of a past that was relentless. She spoke of the sky, of feeling a connection that went beyond science, a sense of homesickness for a place she'd never been. His inner monologue was a silent scream. She speaks of my home as if she'd walked its silver streets. Each word is a grain of salt in a wound I thought had scarred over centuries ago. Does she know she is resurrecting a ghost? One clear, cold night, he found her on the rooftop, her small observatory a sacred space surrounded by the sleeping town. The sky was an ocean of diamonds, vast and achingly beautiful. She was pointing out constellations, her voice full of academic reverence. "That's Cassiopeia," she said, tracing the W in the sky. "And there, Andromeda, our sister galaxy." He stood beside her, the chill night air raising goosebumps on her arms. "The people who came before you had other names for them," he said softly, his voice a low counterpoint to the crickets below. He pointed to a cluster of stars she knew as the Pleiades. "That is the veiled sisterhood, the weavers of fate," he gestured to Draco, "and that is not a dragon. It is the great rift worm who devours dying light." They were names no human scholar knew, names that felt older than language itself. The air between them crackled, the professional distance she had tried to maintain evaporated into the cold night. "My dreams," she whispered, turning to face him. "They don't feel like mine, they feel like memories, and you're always there, not as you are now, but brighter." He looked away from her, up at the star-dusted heavens that were once his birthright and now served as the ceiling of his prison. A profound sadness emanated from him, a loneliness so immense it felt as if it could swallow the moon. "I come from a long way away," he finally admitted, the words torn from him. The unspoken questions hung between them, shimmering with a desperate rising attraction. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell that strange, clean scent of starlight and storms. In that moment, standing on a rooftop in a sleepy town, Nova understood that her fascination with Kael was not just an earthly crush. It was a gravitational pull, an astronomical event, centuries in the making, and she was already caught in its orbit. The storm did not arrive. It descended. One moment, the afternoon was thick with the humid, heavy air of late summer. The next, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple-grey. There was no wind, no distant rumble of thunder, only an oppressive, unnatural stillness that choked the air and made the hairs on Nova's arms stand on end. It was in this claustrophobic quiet that the hunter came to Havenwood. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a being of pure will and void, drawn across galaxies by the sudden, brilliant flare of Kael's resurfacing celestial energy. His connection to Nova, the echo of his long-lost love, had been a beacon in the cosmic dark, and the hunter had followed it to its source. The first attack came as Nova slept. Her dreams of crystal cities and sung languages curdled into nightmares. The silver-haired woman now dissolved into screaming dust before her eyes. The musical language became a cacophony of shrieking discord. The beautiful hollow star was no longer a distant, sad spectacle. It was a hungry maw, pulling her into its cold, empty void. She was tossed through dying galaxies, past worlds of ash and frozen silence, the chill of absolute zero seeping into her bones. She woke with a strangled scream, her body slick with sweat, the cloying smell of burnt ozone and decay thick in her room. Kale felt the psychic assault like a physical blow. It was the signature of a void hunter, a celestial custodian tasked with purging cosmic anomalies. He was the anomaly, and now it was using Nova as bait. He was at her apartment in minutes, the unnatural storm now breaking in a deluge of thick, oily rain that lashed against the windows. He found her huddled in a corner of her bed, shivering, her eyes wide with a terror that was not of this world. The air in the room was cold, imbued with a palpable malevolence. "It was in my dream," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "The cold, the emptiness." He saw the tendrils of shadow coalescing in the corners of the room, a darkness that swallowed light. He knew what he had to do, his long exile, his vow of non-interference. It all meant nothing if she was lost. He rushed to her side, his face a mask of desperation. "Nova, look at me." His voice was a command, sharp and clear. "Don't look away." He placed his hand on her forehead. It was a gesture of profound intimacy and terrible necessity. He closed his eyes and reached for the power he had kept leashed for centuries, the very essence of his being he had sworn to hide. The intricate tattoos on his arms, from his wrists to his shoulders, began to glow. It started as a faint silvery light, then intensified, burning through the fabric of his shirt. Molten silver light traced the alien constellations across his skin, and a wave of pure, clean starlight flooded the room. It was not a hot light, but a cool, powerful luminescence that smelled of distant nebulae and creation itself. The oppressive darkness recoiled, the shadow tendrils hissing as they dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. Nova gasped, her terror shifting its focus. She saw it all. The impossible light pouring from him, the raw power that warped the very air around him. The shadows fled not from a man, but from a god. The kind, gruff mechanic who had fixed her scooter, who smelled of oil and rain, was a vessel for something vast, powerful, and utterly terrifying. When the light subsided, he slumped against the bed, breathing heavily, the glow fading from his skin, but the scent of starlight remaining. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. But she was already pulling away, scrambling to the far side of the bed, her face a canvas of disbelief and fear. It wasn't the hunter she was afraid of anymore. It was him. "That light," she whispered, her voice trembling, broken. "That was in my nightmare. Your hands, God, what are you?" The question hung between them, a chasm of otherness, of fear, of a truth so immense it had shattered the fragile reality they had begun to build. His face, etched with an agony that seemed older than time itself, crumpled. "I am the reason they are hunting you," he said, his voice raw with a pain that ripped through her more keenly than any nightmare. "I am the crime you're paying for." The garage was a maelstrom. Rain hammered against the steel roof in a relentless, deafening rhythm, while lightning tore open the ski, casting the cavernous space in strobes of violent, apocalyptic light. Tools and machinery, once symbols of earthly labour, now threw monstrous shadows that writhed and danced on the slick, oil-stained concrete. It was here, in the place of their beginning, that it would end. The Void Hunter materialised in the centre of the floor. It was no longer just a psychic presence, but a cohesive form, a shifting humanoid silhouette of absolute blackness, a hole in reality that drank the light around it. Its intention was a palpable wave of cold certainty. It had come to reclaim the exile, Kale, and to extinguish the Echo Nova, whose very existence was a cosmic imbalance. Kyle stood between Nova and the creature, his body thrumming with a terrible energy. He had tried to run, to hide, to atone in silence. Now he realised the only way to protect her was to unleash the full horrifying truth of what he was. He glanced back at her, his eyes blazing with a mix of love and despair. "Don't look away, Nova," he commanded, his voice ringing with celestial authority. "Please, bear witness." Then he turned to face his judgment. With a guttural roar that was not human, he shed his mortal guise. The tattoos on his body didn't just glow, they erupted, burning across his skin like molten silver, his entire form shimmering, destabilizing, flickering between the man she knew and a being of pure incandescent starlight. The fight was brutal and elemental. The hunter moved with the silence of the void, its limbs stretching into blades of shadow. Kale met it with raw power, blasts of light that slammed into the darkness with the force of supernovas. The air crackled, smelling of ozone and burning metal as wrenches were thrown, engines were toppled, and the very structure of the garage groaned under the strain of cosmic forces it was never meant to contain. Nova, huddled behind the wreck of a half-restored motorcycle, watched in terror. But as the fight raged, her fear began to transform. She saw past the blinding light and the terrifying power. She saw the pain on Kale's face as he fought, the agony of every blow, the desperation of a being fighting not for his own life, but for hers. She saw the lonely, haunted man who had fixed her scooter, the quiet soul who had drunk tea in her cluttered apartment. He was still in there. He was her Kyle. As the hunter gained the upper hand, wrapping Kale in tendrils of life-draining shadow, Nova stood up. Overcoming the instinct to flee, she found her voice. "Kale!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the cosmic chaos. "Kale, I'm here. Don't let it take you." Her voice, so fragile and human, was the one thing the void could not touch. It was an anchor. Kale's head snapped up, his brilliant eyes finding hers. In that moment of connection, he found a new strength. With a final, blinding burst of energy, he tore the shadows from his body and drove his fist, a conduit of pure starlight, into the heart of the hunter. There was a silent implosion, a rush of cold air, and the creature dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the sound of the rain and their ragged breathing. Kyle collapsed to his knees, his celestial light flickering violently. He was depleted, raw, caught between his two forms. His skin pulsed with a soft, silvery glow, the tattoos swirling like galaxies beneath the surface. He was beautiful and terrifying, a fallen god on a floor of oil and grit. Nova didn't hesitate. She ran to him, her fear gone, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness that overwhelmed everything else. She knelt before him in the wreckage, the rain-soaked air thick with the scent of oil and otherworldly starlight. "Okay?" she whispered, her own tears mixing with the rain dripping from her hair. "You're okay." She reached out a trembling hand and traced the glowing lines on his arm. His skin was impossibly warm, thrumming with a faint vibration. He flinched, not from pain, but from a tenderness he had not known for eons. "Nova," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a desperate, hungry collision of worlds. It was the kiss of a dying star and a sunrise, of fervent grief and sudden, fierce hope. It tasted of rain and tears, of ozone and blood. It was a claiming. Clothes became an impediment, a barrier between two souls who had just witnessed the truth of each other. They were shed not in clumsy haste, but with a sense of reverence, falling away onto the cold, damp concrete. Her hands, brave and certain, explored the strange, new geography of his body. She traced the pathways of his glowing tattoos, feeling the cool, underlying light beneath the heat of his skin. He was no longer just a man, he was a living map of the heavens, and she was learning his terrain by touch. He worshipped her in return, his hands and mouth discovering the soft human warmth of her. He touched her as if she were the most fragile, sacred thing in all of creation. His lips traced the curve of her throat, the swell of her body, the gentle slope of her hip. Each kiss, each caress, was both a question and a statement, an act of reverence for the mortal woman who had seen his monstrous truth and had not run. He laid her back on a pile of discarded shop coats, the rough fabric a stark contrast to the unbearable sensitivity of her skin. When he rose over her, his body was a constellation of soft, pulsing light in the gloom of the ruined garage. As they moved together with a slow, deliberate reverence, each movement a reclamation of a soul he thought was lost. As he moved with her, finding his new true north in the heat and tightness of her body, her gasps were not of this world, but of a soul recognizing its counterpart across time and space, a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure that echoed the chime of stars being born. The climax was not a release, but a fusion. A silent, blinding flash of shared light erupted from where their bodies joined. A supernova of spirit and flesh that left them trembling in the wreckage, bound together, irrevocably, by the sacred act of being truly seen. Dawn broke over a rain-washed Havenwood, the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet earth and nascent possibility. In Kyle's sparse apartment above the garage, the soft morning light filtered through the single window, painting stripes across the tangled sheets and the two figures entwined within them. The celestial glow that had coursed over Kyle's skin had subsided, leaving behind only a faint silvery shimmer, like moonlight trapped beneath his flesh, visible only to her. They lay in the quiet aftermath, their bodies still humming with the echoes of their cataclysmic union. The threat was gone, but the truth remained, a new universe waiting to be navigated between them. He turned to her, his expression stripped of all guards, leaving only a profound vulnerability. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice quiet in the morning stillness. And so he told her everything. He spoke of a time before time, when he was not Kyle, the mechanic, but Ka-El, a prince of the celestial architects. His people were weavers of light, shapers of star systems. His love, his betrothed, was Lyra, a woman with hair of spun silver, and a soul that sang in harmony with the cosmos, the woman from Nova's dreams. But she had been struck by a blight, a cosmic decay that even their power could not heal. In his hubris and grief, Kyle had attempted the forbidden. He tried to reignite her fading life force by collapsing a living star, intending to channel its raw energy into her. But his control slipped. The star didn't just collapse, it inverted, creating a wound in the fabric of reality, the hollow star, and in the ensuing chaos, Lyra was lost completely. His crime had unbalanced the celestial harmony, its echoes causing nascent systems to fail. His punishment was exile, to be stripped of most of his power and bound to a primitive world, to live a mortal life of atonement until his grief and guilt eroded him into dust. "Her soul," he finished, his voice thick with the unshed tears. "It wasn't destroyed. It fractured, echoed across time and space. You are its most perfect echo, Nova. That's why you could dream my memories. That's why the hunter could find me through you." He looked at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it was painful. "They know I am here now. My existence puts you in danger. I can erase your memory of me, of all of this. I can sever the connection. You would be safe. You could go back to your life, to your stars." He gave her a choice, a safe, empty peace, or a dangerous, uncertain future together. Nova looked at the man beside her, the fallen prince who had offered to obliterate himself from her mind for her own protection. She thought of her quiet, lonely life before, her passion confined to cold data and distant, untouchable lights. She was no longer just a stargazer. She was part of the story of the stars. He was her star. Without hesitation, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Then she reached out and laid her palm over his heart, where she could feel the faint thrum of his celestial energy and a small star-shaped scar she had discovered during the night. "Don't you dare," she whispered. Her choice was made. The love they made that morning was nothing like the desperate reclaiming passion in the garage. This was a soulful renewal, a promise sealed in the quiet light of a new day. His kisses were slow and tender, tasting of the coffee she had made, speaking of shared mornings and a future, not just a fleeting stolen moment. It was a dance of equals. She was no longer just a mortal woman. She held the echoes of a cosmic songstress within her. He was no longer a prince in penitent exile. He was a man who had found his home. As he moved with her, it was a gentle, deliberate rhythm, a silent vow. Her hands on his back were not just exploring but reassuring. His body, still shimmering with that faint secret light, was not alien, but hers to know. Her touch reminded him what it was to be human, to be grounded, to be loved not for power or a title, but for the flawed, grieving, hopeful soul within. His touch reminded her that she was, and always had been, made of stardust. The act was a quiet conversation, a sealing of their new, shared destiny against the silence of the waking town. He had fallen from the heavens thinking he was lost to the void, a solitary point of light in an endless dark. But as he held her, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of her heart against his, Cale finally understood. A soul does not need a whole galaxy to find its way home, only the light of a single steadfast star to call its own. The Last Bell of Autumn. Blackwood Academy was less a school and more a mausoleum of ambition. It stood sentinel on a hill in New England, a collection of Gothic stone buildings that clawed at the perpetually grey sky. Its grounds a carefully curated wilderness of ancient oaks and whispering pines. The air, crisp and sharp, carried the mingled scents of wood smoke from the town below and the damp, sweet decay of fallen leaves. It was a place of gilded melancholy, where the rustle of turning pages in the cavernous library and the distant mournful chime of the bell tower were the only true measures of time's relentless passage. The world outside the iron gates, a world of noise and chaos and messy, unpredictable life, was a distant rumour, a place one read about in leather-bound books but never truly inhabited. Nathaniel Croft, scion of the Croft dynasty, moved through this hallowed space with the effortless grace of a man who knew he belonged, yet felt no particular attachment to it. He was a ghost in his own life, a spectator to his own carefully orchestrated future. His intelligence was a blade he kept sheathed, his wit a shield, his detachment a fortress. He existed in a state of perpetual, cynical observation, a habit born of a childhood spent in sprawling empty houses, where love was a transaction and affection a commodity to be dispensed in carefully measured doses. His father, a man who measured the world in quarterly reports and stock prices, had a life mapped out for Nathaniel that was as predictable as the changing of the seasons. Blackwood, then Oxford, then a seat on the board of Croft Industries. It was a future of immense privilege and profound emptiness, and Nathaniel, in his quiet, simmering rebellion, yearned to disrupt it, to throw a wrench in the works of the great, grinding machine of his destiny. His act of defiance when it came was not a grand gesture, but a small, cynical act of sabotage. A philosophy essay, a meaningless exercise in intellectual posturing, became his weapon. He didn't plagiarize for a grade. He had no need for such pedestrian validation, but to prove a point, to demonstrate the utter indifference of the system he was a part of. He lifted a passage from a relatively obscure dissertation, a piece of academic arcana he was sure no one at Blackwood had ever read, and wove it seamlessly into his own elegant, empty prose. It was a perfect crime, a silent stream into the void. He was, of course, caught. The headmaster, a man with the weary eyes of a zookeeper who has seen every trick the animals can perform, did not summon Nathaniel's father. That would have been an inconvenience, a disruption to the delicate ecosystem of alumni donations and societal expectations. Instead, he chose a punishment that was, in its own way, far more insidious. "Expulsion is too easy, Nathaniel," the headmaster said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "It's what you want, isn't it? A grand exit, a dramatic severing of ties. No, I think we need something a bit more restorative. You will join the drama department's autumn production of Cyrano de Bergerac." Nathaniel felt a cold, hard knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The theatre, a place of earnest, messy emotion, of overwrought sentiment and performative vulnerability. He despised it. "Perhaps, Nathaniel," the headmaster continued, a faint, ironic smile playing on his lips, "learning to pretend to be someone else will teach you something about being yourself." And so Nathaniel found himself pushing open the heavy oak doors of the theatre, a place he had avoided for his entire tenure at Blackwood. The air inside was thick with the scent of old scripts, a heady mixture of paper, dust and dried glue, and the faint, lingering aroma of sweat and stage paint. A single bare bulb on a stand, the ghost light, cast long dancing shadows across the empty stage, a solitary sentinel in the darkness. It was in this dusty, hallowed space that he first saw her. Abigail Hayes. She was standing centre stage, bathed in the soft glow of the ghost light, rehearsing a monologue. She was all fire and light, her voice a clarion call that seemed to warm the cavernous empty space. Her gestures were fluid and expressive, her body a conduit for the raw, untamed emotion of the words she spoke. She was the antithesis of everything he was, passion to his restraint, light to his shadow. When she finished, she turned, and her eyes, the colour of warm honey, met his. They were eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade, to the hollow space within. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice still ringing with the echoes of her performance. "I'm here for the play," he said, his own voice sounding thin and reedy in the vastness of the theatre. A flicker of amusement danced in her eyes. "Are you? I didn't take you for the theatrical type." "I'm not," he said, a touch of his usual irony returning to him. "I'm a prisoner of war." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "Well, welcome to the front lines. What's your name, prisoner?" "Nathaniel Croft." "Abigail Hayes," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her palm warm. "I'm playing Roxane." He was, to his eternal mortification, cast as Christian, the handsome but artless suitor, a role he found insultingly simple, a two-dimensional caricature of a man. He was to be the face, the beautiful, empty vessel for another man's words, another man's soul. During their first rehearsal together, his delivery was flat, his movements stiff. He read the lines with a cool detachment that bordered on contempt. Abigail, ever the professional, tried to guide him, to coax some semblance of feeling from him. "The lines are just the map, Mr. Croft," she said, her patience already wearing thin. "The feeling is the territory. Are you planning on visiting or just looking at it from the border?" He had no answer for her. He had spent his entire life learning that feeling was a liability, a port from which one must always be ready to sail. And as he stood there on that dusty stage, under the watchful eye of the ghost light, he felt a strange, unfamiliar tremor in the foundations of his carefully constructed world. It was the first tolling of a bell he had never heard before, a sound that was both a warning and an invitation. The days shortened, the leaves turned from crimson to gold, and the air grew colder, carrying the promise of the coming winter. Nathaniel's punishment became a strange sort of purgatory, a sentence he served in the hidden, forgotten corners of the academy, the echoing empty theatre late at night, the secluded bench in the memorial garden where the leaves fell like silent tears, the hushed upper stacks of the library where the air was thick with the scent of old books and forgotten stories. These became his sanctuary, his confessional, his classroom. He began to stay late, long after the director had called an end to rehearsals, drawn by a force he couldn't quite name. It was Abigail, of course. She was always there, a solitary figure on the dimly lit stage. Her passion, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. She would run her lines, her voice filling the empty space, and he would watch from the shadows, a silent, unseen audience. One night he found the courage to step out of the darkness and onto the stage. "You're going to wear yourself out," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She turned, startled, a hand flying to her chest. "You scared me." "Sorry," he said, and he meant it. "It's fine," she said, her voice a little breathless. I need to get this right." "It's already right," he said. "It's more than right. It's perfect." A faint blush crept up her neck. Perfection is a myth. There's always room for improvement. And so their stolen rehearsals began. Away from the critical eyes of the director and the rest of the cast, they ran their scenes together, over and over again. She coached him, her patience a stark contrast to her initial frustration. She tried to coax real emotion from his guarded delivery, to teach him the language of the heart, a language he had never learned to speak. "You're not just saying the words, Nathaniel," she would say, her hand on his arm, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. "You're feeling them. They're your words. They're coming from a place deep inside you, a place you've kept locked away." During one of these late-night sessions, as she was in the middle of a particularly emotional speech, she faltered. Her breath caught in her throat and a tremor ran through her hand. She dismissed it with a wave of her hand, a forced smile on her face. "Just tired," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Long day." But he saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of a vulnerability she kept hidden beneath her vibrant facade. It was the first crack in her armour, and it intrigued him more than her strength. It made her real, human, fragile. Their scripts became a silent conversation, a secret correspondence that unfolded in the margins of the printed text. He would leave a cynical comment, a barbed observation, and she would reply with a challenging question, a gentle prodding. Soon the notes became more personal, fragments of their lives shared in the quiet intimacy of the late-night hours. He wrote of his lonely childhood, of the cavernous, empty houses and the ghost of a father who was never there. She wrote of her dreams of the stage, of the burning desire to live 1,000 lives, to feel 1,000 emotions. "Is it easier to love a soul you've never seen?" he wrote one night, his pen scratching in the silence of the empty theatre. The next day her reply was waiting for him. "Is it easier to show your soul when you think no one is looking?" One evening, as they were rehearsing Roxane's speech of love, something shifted. She stood before him, her eyes shining in the dim light, and delivered the lines with a raw, heartbreaking sincerity that transcended the text. For the first time he didn't hear the character. He heard her. He felt the weight of her words, the depth of her feeling, and it was as if a hand had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. He felt an unfamiliar ache, a yearning he couldn't name, a desperate desire to be worthy of such profound, unselfish love. In the quiet of the stage, with only the ghost light for an audience, her voice filled all the empty spaces inside him he hadn't known were there. He was a ship that had been sailing on a vast empty ocean, and she was the first sight of land, the promise of a safe harbour. And as he looked at her, at this girl who was all fire and light and life, he felt a terrifying, exhilarating thought take root in his heart. He was falling in love with her. The world, which had seemed to shrink to the size of the small, intimate space between them, came crashing back in with a brutal, unforgiving force. The golden warmth of autumn gave way to the stark, cold beauty of late fall, the trees shedding their fiery leaves like a final, desperate act of defiance before the long, silent sleep of winter. The air grew sharp and thin, and the sky seemed to hang low and heavy over the stone buildings of Blackwood. The shift in the season mirrored the change in their own small world. The quiet intimacy of their late-night rehearsals was replaced by the bright, harsh glare of the stage lights, the critical eyes of the director, the rustling of scripts in the hands of the full cast. The magic of their stolen moments seemed to dissipate in the cold, clear light of day. The collapse came during a full-cast rehearsal, a week before the play was set to open. Abigail was in the middle of a scene, her voice soaring to the rafters, her body alive with the passion of her character. And then, in an instant, the light in her seemed to flicker and die. She stumbled, her hand flying to her head, a look of confusion and fear on her face, and then she crumpled to the floor, a small, fragile heap in the centre of the vast, empty stage. The world seemed to stop. The director's shouts, the gasps of the cast, the frantic scramble to her side. It all seemed to happen in slow motion, a dream from which Nathaniel couldn't wake. He stood frozen in the wings, a cold, sickening dread coiling in his stomach. The illusion of her wellness, the vibrant facade she had so carefully constructed, had shattered for everyone to see. He waited outside the infirmary, the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic burning his nostrils, the rhythmic beeping of a machine, a maddening counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. Her parents, a handsome, silver-haired couple, with the same warm, honey-coloured eyes as their daughter, arrived in a flurry of hushed whispers and worried glances. It was from them that he learned the truth, a truth that was far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. Abigail had a progressive neuromuscular disease, a cruel, relentless thief that was slowly, inexorably stealing her life from her. Her time wasn't just fleeting, it was being actively, brutally taken. The play, he realised with a sickening lurch, was not a stepping stone to a career, a bright future on the stages of New York or London. It was her last great act of defiance, her final desperate attempt to burn as brightly as she could before the darkness consumed her. As he reeled from this revelation, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his father. The conversation was clipped, transactional, a series of commands disguised as questions. Oxford applications, a scheduled flight to London for Christmas. The real world, his father's voice a cold metallic drone in his ear, awaited. "Don't get distracted by temporary things," his father said, and the words, which had once been a comforting reminder of his own detachment, now felt like a death sentence. He was a coward. The thought, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of his shock and grief. He was a coward, and he was afraid. Not of her illness, not of the pain and the suffering that lay ahead, but of the love he felt for her, a love that was now inextricably intertwined with the certainty of loss. He was afraid of the immense, all-consuming pain of losing her, a pain he knew would shatter him, leave him broken and adrift in a world without her light. He retreated, his aloofness returning like a shield, his cynicism a suit of armour. He avoided the infirmary, the sight of her fragile body in that sterile white bed more than he could bear. He missed a rehearsal, the thought of standing on that stage, in that space that had been theirs, a torment. He saw her fragility not as something to be cherished, a precious, fleeting gift, but as a future of pain he was not equipped to handle. She was a burning star, and he was a coward, already calculating the distance to save himself from the inevitable darkness that would follow her light. He was his father's son, after all, a man who knew how to cut his losses, how to walk away from a bad investment. And Abigail, with her fierce, beautiful, dying light, was the worst investment of all. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke, unleashing its fury on the unsuspecting world. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the old mullioned windows of the theatre, and the rain came down in sheets, a relentless, percussive drumming on the slate roof. It was a night for ghosts and secrets, for confessions and reckonings. The headmaster, his face a mask of weary resignation, had delivered the final blow. Abigail would not be allowed to perform. It was too risky, he said. Her health was too fragile. The words, delivered with a gentle, paternalistic finality, were a death sentence. Her last dream, the one thing that had kept her fighting, had been taken from her. Nathaniel, hearing the news, felt a surge of a rage so fierce it stole his breath. He found her where he knew she would be, on the empty stage, a solitary figure in the dim glow of the ghostlight. She wasn't crying. Her grief was too raw, too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot of rage in her chest, a fire that burned in her eyes. "So, you came to see the tragic heroine in her final act," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Come to offer your condolences, your pity." "Abigail, he began, but she cut him off, her voice rising with each word. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice trembling with a fury that was both terrifying and magnificent. "Don't you dare look at me with pity. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime. I wanted a scene partner, not an audience to my tragedy." She turned on him then, her eyes blazing, and the words poured out of her, a torrent of pain and anger and love. She accused him of being a ghost long before he met her, of being too afraid to live a single moment with genuine feeling. She accused him of being a coward, a man who ran from the first sign of trouble, the first hint of real, messy, unpredictable life. Her words struck home, each one a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his defences. He had no answer for her, no witty retort, no cynical observation. There was only the truth, raw and ugly and undeniable. He broke, the carefully constructed facade of the man who didn't care, the man who was above it all, shattered into a million pieces. He confessed his fear, his voice a choked whisper in the vast empty space. Not of her illness, he told her, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperate, belated honesty, but of his love for her, of the immense, all-consuming pain of losing her. He admitted that she was the first real thing in his transient, meaningless life, the first person who had ever made him feel anything at all. The performance, the one he had been giving his entire life, fell away, leaving only two terrified, vulnerable people, stripped bare in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. The argument dissolved into a shuddering silence, the space between them humming with the unspoken words, the raw, aching need. He stepped toward her, his movements hesitant, his body a question. He didn't touch her at first, just stood before her, his eyes pleading with her to see the utter, complete surrender in them. When she gave a small broken sob, a sound that tore through him like a physical blow, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were both infinitely precious and the only thing anchoring him to the world. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the sweet, clean fragrance of soap and rain and something that was uniquely, indefinably her. He kissed her then, and it was a kiss of profound, desperate tenderness. It wasn't about seduction or passion or desire, but about affirmation, about a silent, solemn vow to stay, to fight, to love for however long they had. His mouth was warm and soft on hers, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped them both. He kissed her, like he was breathing her in, trying to memorize the very essence of her, the taste of her skin, the feel of her lips against his. His hands traced the line of her back, feeling the fragile strength there, the delicate bones beneath the soft fabric of her sweater. He drew shivers from her that were not from the cold, but from a need that was as deep and as vast as his own. When their bodies pressed together, it was terror and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh, every gasp, every trembling breath seemed to carry a lifetime of longing and a promise to face the storm together, for however long they had. The world outside raged, the wind and the rain a symphony of chaos and destruction, but in the small sacred space of the empty stage, illuminated by the single steady glow of the ghost light, they found a quiet, fragile peace, a shelter from the storm. The night of the play's premiere arrived, a night of bitter-sweet poignancy, of endings and beginnings. The air was thick with the scent of nervous energy and hairspray. The backstage area a flurry of activity, a controlled chaos of actors in various states of dress and undress, of stagehands barking orders, of the low, expectant murmur of the audience settling into their seats. But for Nathaniel and Abigail, the world had once again shrunk, this time to the quiet intimacy of her dressing room, a small cluttered space that had become their sanctuary. Nathaniel had made a choice. The airline ticket to London, a symbol of his old life, of his carefully orchestrated future, lay torn in half in the bottom of a wastebasket. He had called his father, his voice steady and clear, and informed him that he would not be flying to London for the holidays. He was staying. He was not running, not anymore. He had used his family's resources, the privilege he had once so despised, not to escape, but to create. He had arranged with the theatre tech to have the stage for 1 hour before the official show, a single stolen hour in the eye of the storm. He led Abigail, her hand in his, to the empty theatre. The stage was not lit with the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlights, but with a soft, warm glow, a single, perfect circle of light in the centre of the vast, empty space. He had filled the wings with her favourite flowers, late-blooming autumn roses, their scent a sweet, fragrant promise in the dusty air. For an audience of one another, they performed their final scene from Cyrano, the balcony scene where love is confessed purely, through words, through soul. They didn't need the costumes, the props, the artifice of the stage. They were not Christian or Cyrano or Roxane. They were just Nathaniel and Abigail, and the words, which had once been a map to a territory he was afraid to visit, were now the truest expression of his heart. When they finished, the silence that followed was not empty, but full, resonant with the depth of their shared emotion. As the final bell of autumn tolled across the campus, a sound that was no longer mournful but a gentle, poignant reminder of the preciousness of time, they sat on the edge of the stage, their legs dangling into the darkness of the orchestra pit. He told her then, his voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet of the empty theatre, that he had deferred his acceptance to Oxford for a year. He wasn't running. He was staying. For her, for them, for whatever time they had left. Back in the quiet of the dressing room, the sounds of the official play beginning were a distant murmur, a world away. They were exhausted, emotionally bare, their hearts laid open. There was no need for grand passion now, for desperate clinging kisses. There was only a profound, resonant closeness, a quiet intimacy that was more powerful than any performance. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her palm, and brought it to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. He read to her from a book of poetry they both loved, his voice a low, steady anchor in the quiet room, a gentle melody against the distant, muffled sounds of the play. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her breathing evening out, her body relaxing into his. The intimacy was in the shared silence, the complete lack of pretense, the simple, profound comfort of being together. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her temple, a promise not of forever, but of now, of this moment, this breath, this heartbeat. It was a connection that was absolute, a quiet bloom of love in the face of an encroaching winter. As he looked at her, at the way the dim light of the dressing room softened the lines of her face, at the gentle rise and fall of her chest, he knew that a life was not measured in the number of its seasons, but in the one autumn that truly matters, the one that teaches us to love against the falling of the leaves. The last autumn leaf caught by the wind tapped against the dressing room window, a gentle, insistent reminder of the beauty and the fragility of it all. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Croft was not afraid. He was home.